you very much. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. I will say, though, that this trip to Canada has been very stressful. I arrived in Vancouver on Sunday, and my hotel was right next to the football stadium, where, of course, the Grey Cup was going on, and my only thought was, what if BC loses? And I know that Vancouver's history with losing sports teams is not what it should be, and I didn't know, should I board up the windows of my hotel? Should I call for an armed guard if I went out for a walk? So that was, and then I realized I had to go to Calgary next, and I looked on the news and I learned that Calgary, of course, had succumbed to some titanic windstorm. And I wondered, if I go to Toronto next, will there be a plague of locusts? Is Canada in the grip of some biblical disaster? Anyway, this is the first time I've ever said this. I'll be very pleased to go back to the relative calm of New York City after this. So I wanted to tell you a story tonight. I like to tell stories. And the story I wanted to tell you is about a woman named Alva Vanderbilt. And Alva Vanderbilt is one of the great insurgents of the 20th century. She is a woman who played an incredibly important role in the suffragette movement, in the movement for women's voting rights in the early part of the 20th century. And what's interesting about Alva Vanderbilt's story is that it's not at all clear why she became an insurgent. It's a bit of a puzzle. She doesn't fit our normal definition, profile, of someone who would take arms against the forces of power and authority. And so I thought I would talk about her story in a way of getting at that question. Why do people choose to rebel? Why do they choose to rise up against oppression and dictators and established power? And that turns out to be, I think, an incredibly relevant topic for the world we live in. Right? We're surrounded over the last couple of years with examples of people who have chose to take that difficult and lonely step. And I think it's a very useful way, a very useful exercise to try and sit back and understand why that happens. So Alva Vanderbilt she's born in Mobile, Alabama. Her father was a cotton merchant who moves to New York City in the 1880s. And he loses a lot of his fortune. And so she grows up in New York City as someone slightly on the outside looking in. And she is a remarkable woman, a remarkable child and a remarkable woman. She's kind of short, and she has a sort of a severe face and long, prematurely gray hair. One of her friends once described her as looking like a cute Pekingese, which is slightly inaccurate because she actually has more in common with a pit bull than a Pekingese. She has, to put it mildly, a very strong personality. She has an ego as large as this room. She has a volcanic temper. She is someone who always needs to get her way. She has an outsized sense of her own importance. And she grows up to be a powerhouse. And she looks around New York City and she decides the only way she can fulfill the enormous expectations she has for her own life is to marry someone with a lot of money. And so she looks over New York society and her eye settles on a young man named Willie Vanderbilt, who is dashing and handsome and well-dressed and an excellent sportsman, and who also just happens to be the grandson of the richest man in the world, Commodore Vanderbilt. And she captures his heart, and they get married. And she quickly bears him a daughter named Consuelo, and then she sets about to go on one of the most extraordinary trips of conspicuous consumption in the history of conspicuous consumption. And as someone who's lived in New York City for the last 15 years, I can tell you I know a fair bit about conspicuous consumption. Her first act is to buy 800 acres in Long Island and to build a country estate, something in shingles overlooking the bay. And then she decides she needs a proper home in New York City, and so she purchases the entire corner of 52nd and Fifth Avenue, and she builds an imitation French chateau, which costs in $1890, $3 million, which if you do the math, comes out to a couple of $100 million in today's currency. And to give you a sense of what that mansion was like, let me read to you the following description from one of the many books on the Vanderbilt houses, which are all case studies in what might be called real estate pornography. Everything was everywhere. Walls of red African marble, of stamped leather, walls hung with blue silk brocade, with red velvet embroidered with leaves, flowers, and butterflies, enriched with cut crystal and precious stones, ceilings of mahogany, of bronze, of colored glass, of bamboo, wainscoting of rosewood inlaid with mother of pearl and brass, ebony inlaid with ivory, polished ebony inlaid with satinwood, and Grecian, Oriental, Elizabethan, English, Renaissance, French, and Victorian touches in crowded rooms bursting with bronze, stained glass, marble, mosaics, and friezes. I think you get the picture, just what that house was like. Then she decides she wants to build herself a yacht. So she builds the largest private yacht ever built, up to that point, 285 feet, large even by Alberta standards. And she calls her yacht the Alva, of course. It has a staff of 52, just to give you a sense of. Then she decides she wants a country cottage. And I will only say this about the country cottage, that she has to import 500,000 cubic feet of white Italian marble just for the facade. Right? She builds that in Newport, Rhode Island. Now she has the country house, the cottage, the city house, and the yacht. Her attention turns to her daughter, Consuelo. And Consuelo is a shy, awkward young girl, but Alva has the highest expectations for her. She forces her to wear to be a prisoner of the most constraining corset so that her posture can be absolutely perfect. And she allows her to address her family members only in French. And every Sunday night she must recite from memory poems in German to the assembled family members. And if she makes the slightest slip in public, Alva angrily and rudely corrects her. And she grooms her to be this child of society. And when Consuelo comes to marriageable age, Alva decides that she wants to marry her daughter off into English royalty. Now, this was not an unusual idea at the time. In the Gilded Age, in the 1890s, it was a common practice for the wealthy daughters of American industrialists to be married into English aristocracy, to be married to penniless English aristocrats. The technical term for this arrangement at the time was cash for class. But Alva being Alva, she sets her sights on the grandest catch of all, who was a 23-year-old young man named Richard John Spencer Churchill, otherwise known as the 9th Duke of Marlborough, first cousin of Winston Churchill and the lineal ancestor of Princess Di. And his nickname was Sonny. And Sonny was the heir to Blenheim Palace, the largest private residence in the country of England, a house that spanned 7 acres and that made Alva's house at the corner of 52nd and 5th Avenue look like a ranch-style bungalow. Anyway, Blenheim Palace is falling apart, and the Duke of Marlborough hasn't got the money to fix it. And once Alva hears that, she realizes that he will make a perfect match for her daughter. Now, there's only 2 problems with this idea. The first is that Sonny is not Sonny. He is actually an incredibly miserable man. And to give you a sense of what he was like, his second wife, Emily Deacon, used to sleep in a bedroom all by herself with a revolver by her bed in case her husband should choose to visit her in the middle of the night. The second problem with this marriage is that Consuelo is in love with someone else. She has fallen for a young man named Winthrop Rutherford, or Wintry as he was known. And Wintry was an Adonis. He was this brilliantly charismatic, good-looking, well-dressed sportsman who was charming and an incredible dancer. And he is from one of the very best families in all of New York. And he has started to woo Consuelo, and he has won her heart. On her 18th birthday, she gets a single long-stemmed red rose delivered to her, and she knows it's from Wintry. And not long after that, she goes for a bicycle ride up Riverside Drive with Wintry, and Alva is there, of course, as a chaperone. And as they approach a corner, Wintry and looks over at Consuelo, and both of them speed up. And once they're out of sight of Alva, they look at each other and they exchange a few choice words. And Alva, of course, is pedaling to catch up with them as fast as she can. And when she comes across the two lovers and she looks in their eyes, she knows something of importance has passed between them. And the very next day, she essentially kidnaps her daughter and takes her to Paris. And every one of the letters that the anguished, love-struck Wintry writes to Consuelo, Alva intercepts and destroys. And then at the end of the season, when Alva takes Consuelo to the cottage in Newport, Rhode Island, she forbids her daughter from leaving the house. She locks her up like Rapunzel in her castle because she's worried if she goes out, she will run into Wintry, and they will start over in their love affair. And at a certain point, Consuelo becomes distraught because she's been denied a chance to spend time with her betrothed. And she goes and she climbs the stairs to Alva's palatial bedroom on the second floor of the cottage in Rhode Island, and that massive room with these cherubs holding shields emblazoned with the letter A. At this point, you should know what's coming. And she says to her mother, I'm engaged to marry Wintry. I have a right to choose who I'm going to marry. And her mother stands up to her, this all 5 foot of Alva, and she says, you do not. Right? Do you have any idea what's at stake? You will become a duchess. Right? And she forbids her. And then when Consuelo starts to speak up to defend herself, Alva shouts her down and launches into the most vitriolic denunciation of Wintry. And finally, Consuelo realizes that there's no point. She can't defy her mother. Her mother is this dynamo, this extraordinarily powerful figure. She has no hope. And on November 6th, 1895, New York witnesses one of the most extraordinary weddings in all of its history. The scion to the granddaughter of one of the richest men of all time marries one of the most eligible aristocrats in all of Europe. And you can imagine the scene. Like, wedding takes place in St. Thomas's Cathedral on Fifth Avenue, and the crowds are lined up and down the street to catch a glimpse of this glamorous couple, and every journalist in all of America is there to record the event, and the police are keeping the crowds at bay, and every famous person in the entire country is invited, and Alva has hired 82 decorators to fill the church with flowers, and at the beginning of the ceremony, Alva strides down the aisle, flanked by her 2 young sons, wearing a blue silk dress with a border of Russian sable. And she stands at the front of the church, waiting in this moment of glory for her daughter. And she waits first 5 minutes, and Consuelo doesn't show up. Then 10 minutes, she doesn't show up. And then 15 minutes. And why hasn't she showed up? Because she is back downstairs in the church, weeping inconsolably in the arms of her father. And finally, they clear away her tears and they readjust her makeup. And she walks up the aisle, and she's married to the Duke of Marlborough. And immediately after the ceremony, Alva whisks the 2 of them back to a room at the rear of the church, and they sign the prenup, which guarantees the Duke a cash payment of $2.5 million up front in $1895, by the way, and an annual stipend of $150,000. And then the young married couple climb into a carriage to drive away, and the Duke, Sonny, turns to his wife and he says, I don't love you. I never will love you. Your responsibility is to bear me an heir and to fix up Blenheim Palace, and that's the end of it. And she starts to cry, of course. And then she looks back through the back of the carriage, and she sees her mother standing at the sidewalk watching them go away. And her mother has tears as well, but not tears of sorrow as far as she can tell, but tears of triumph, because this is the greatest moment of her life. You know, this girl, this down at her luck girl from Mobile, Alabama, has married her daughter into one of the grandest families in all of the world. There can be no bigger moment in all of Alba's life, or so she thinks, right? Because Alba's life is about to get very, very interesting. Now, I described Alba at the very beginning as a radical, as an insurgent. And I think you can see that that's a very unlikely description, right? The ranks of radicals and insurgents rarely come from people who spend their formative years building extraordinarily large and ostentatious houses, right? Kim Kardashian is not about to join Al-Qaeda, right? Is she? So how do we make sense of this transformation that this woman apparently underwent at some point in her life? And I think in order to understand that, we have to take a step back and to understand something about why people choose to rebel. Why is it that people choose at given moments in their life or in history to defy authority? Now, that's obviously an enormous question, but the standard answer that economists and political scientists and historians have given over the years is that authority creates obedience through the use of deterrence, right? If an individual or a group or a society wants, or a country wants someone to do something, it rewards them for obeying the law and punishes them for disobeying the law. This is the principle on which our criminal justice system is based. We don't want people to deal drugs, so we punish them when we catch them dealing drugs. And if they continue to deal drugs, even after we punish them, we respond by raising the punishment, right? And if you look what has happened in the United States over the last 25 years, the penalties for dealing drugs have been steadily increased to the point now where if you're caught dealing drugs, particularly crack cocaine, you can go to prison for longer than if you're caught murdering somebody, right? That's how we have applied, or the United States has applied the theory of deterrence to a behavior like dealing drugs. Now, there's an obvious problem with this, and that is even after raising the penalties for drug dealing to about as high as they can conceivably go, people continue to deal drugs, right? Drug dealing hasn't gone away. So in response to that apparent failure of deterrence, a whole new group of scholars have risen up and said, you know what, there has to be a better explanation for why people either choose to obey or to defy the law. And this group has focused not on the nature of punishment, but on how punishment is enacted. And what this group has said is, the real issue is not deterrence, but rather it is the legitimacy of punishment. That when people perceive the system that they are dealing with to be legitimate, they obey the law. And when they perceive it to be illegitimate, they don't. Now, what does legitimacy mean? Well, there are three things that we believe to be the cornerstones of legitimate authority. The first is that legitimacy comes from treating people with respect, with allowing them to state their case, to give them what lawyers like to call standing. Right? I will listen to you before I choose to punish you or discipline you. The second thing is legitimacy is based on neutrality. In order for the law to be considered legitimate, for authority to be legitimate, it must treat all people equally. It must be fair. It cannot privilege one class over another. Right? And the third thing is that legitimacy comes when the law is trustworthy, which is to say that it's predictable. That I know that the way I am treated today is not going to dramatically change tomorrow. There isn't, in other words, an arbitrary element to the way that authority is constructed. Rather, it's based on some consistent set of principles. Now, think about just how dramatically different that way of understanding authority is from the notion of deterrence. Deterrence is all about a rational response to a set of risks and benefits. It says that we are all these coldly logical actors who assess the penalties and the benefits of any given activity and proceed accordingly. Right? Legitimacy theory, on the other hand, is all about a subjective feeling. It says that I choose to behave the way I behave in any kind of setting when I feel when I feel that I'm being treated legitimately. And if I feel subjectively that I'm not being treated with neutrality, trustworthiness, and respect, then I will defy authority. Right? The second difference is that deterrence is all entirely about ends. When we assess the power of a deterrent, we are entirely concerned with the nature of the punishment. Are you going to jail for 5 years or 10 years? Are you hitting someone with 100 bombs or 1,000 bombs? Are you going to war with 1,000 men or 100,000 men? But legitimacy is entirely about means. It says, actually, at the end of the day, it might not matter that much whether the penalty is 5 years or 10 years, or whether the war is conducted with 1,000 people or 100,000 people. What matters is how you choose to conduct that war. What are the principles that drive your action? How does the person that you are seeking to discipline view the nature and legitimacy of your actions? Now, I could go on and on in delineating the differences between these two very different ways of understanding why people choose to comply with the law. But there is one very clear and I think crucial implication that runs through every bit of this revisionist understanding of why people choose to comply with authority. It is that when you deny people legitimacy, even if they are powerless and marginal and weak and not central in any way to your society, they will rise up. That's the condition under which people choose to rebel. And how much you crack down on them when they choose to rebel is going to make very little difference, will make little or no difference, because nothing serves as a greater engine of defiance than the feeling that you have been treated illegitimately. Right? The feeling that you have not been treated with respect and neutrality and trustworthiness. And this is the first crucial fact in understanding what happened to Alva Vanderbilt, because she came to believe that she lived in a society that did not grant her legitimacy. Now that seems very hard to believe because as I described her, she's a woman of extraordinary privilege, right? She's about as rich as you can get in the Gilded Age in 1890s America. She's got a staff of 52 just on her yacht, right? She got to import 500,000 cubic feet of white Italian marble just for the facade of her country cottage, right? You can't imagine a woman with more privilege. But the truth is that the world that she inhabits and the world that all women of her class inhabited in that era was incredibly narrow and oppressive. She and all the other wives of the wealthy of that time were confined to their homes. They couldn't participate meaningfully in public life in any way. They couldn't participate in politics. They couldn't vote. They couldn't play a role in the charitable world. They couldn't voice their opinions. They could do nothing except dress nicely and give parties. That was their responsibility, right? They had to stay home and keep up a respectful appearance. The men, meanwhile, were free to do whatever they wanted. Go anywhere, do anything, engage in the most interesting things they could imagine, behave in any way that they wanted. Do you know what the divorce laws were like in 1890? If a man wanted to divorce a woman, he need only accuse her of infidelity. If a woman wanted to divorce a man, she needed to prove infidelity on the part of her husband and also prove physical cruelty, right? That's a dramatic difference in the way people are treated. Right? A man of that era could satisfy every whim that he wanted. If he wanted to have a mistress on the side, he could. If he wanted to visit a prostitute every night, he could. If he wanted to go off on a party on J.P. Morgan's yacht for the weekend, he could. And that's exactly what Alva's husband, Willie Vanderbilt, was up to. He was the biggest playboy of them all. Here's this rich guy with nothing to do, this good-looking playboy. And what did he do while he was married to Alva? Well, he had one affair after another while Alva stayed at home. Right? In fact, On the outside, Alva was this triumphant society hostess, but on the inside, she was dying. And she would later describe the years leading up to Consuelo's wedding as the unhappiest of her life. And she meets a man who she truly loves, but she realizes nothing can come of it, right? Men can have affairs, women can't have affairs. And just before Consuelo's wedding, in a last-ditch attempt to rekindle her marriage, she has the whole family go on a cruise to India. And in the middle of the cruise, Willie, her husband, starts a very public affair with Alva's best friend. And then when the cruise ends and they go to Paris, he starts an even more public affair with a high-class prostitute. And it's all over the tabloids at the time. And Alva is completely humiliated. And finally she has enough. And she kicks him out of the house. And she files for divorce. Right? But of course, divorce is something that is completely unheard of in her time and place. And all of the lawyers from the Vanderbilt family descend on her and try to talk her out of it and try to get her to withdraw the petition. And the tabloids write about it endlessly and gear up for what's going to be the most extraordinary tabloid story of the generation, right? This woman divorcing the richest man of her time. Right? And she comes out of church in Newport, Rhode Island, with people who she's known for 20 years, and every single one of them turns their back to her because she's doing something that is considered unspeakable in the society of her time. But she feels she's got no choice. Right? The situation is absolutely impossible. Her husband is humiliating her. And later in her life, she writes her memoirs, and she has this, I think, really extraordinary line where she describes what it was like to be a woman in that moment. And she says, "It was considered religious, dignified, and correct for the wife to withdraw into the shadows while her husband paid the family respects to the sunshine. She was supposed to get her sunlight by proxy through her husband." And I think that heartbreaking phrase, sunlight by proxy, helps to put a lot of Alva's seemingly outrageous behavior into perspective. You know, here was this brilliant, ambitious, driven woman, and if she was around today, she would have gone out and founded companies or run for office or played some incredibly central role in the society of her day. But back then, all of that was denied to her. The only thing her society allowed her to do was to look after the house. So what did she do? Well, the only thing she could do, build the most extravagant houses she could, right? I think it also makes sense of her seemingly outrageous behavior over her daughter's wedding. You know, Wintry Rutherford, when he meets and starts to woo Consuelo, is 33 years old. Consuelo is 18. And he's this handsome man from this rich, dissolute family in New York. The nicest thing that was said about the Rutherfords at the time was that they were known for, quote, wearing expensive clothing. This is a guy who spent all of his days playing polo and golf in the Newport Country Club. And she looks at him and she sees just another version of the same man she married, Willie Vanderbilt, an idle, decadent philanderer who will sentence her daughter to a lifetime of misery. And she says, I can't do that. I can't allow my daughter to do this, right? At least the Duke of Marlborough, as miserable as he is part of another society far away. And at least if she marries him, she'll have serious social position. She'll be an important figure in the society of her time and have a chance to make something of her life, right? That's the bargain that Alva makes. And to our eyes, it seems incredibly cynical, because after all, Consuelo was in love with Wintry, and we think love is the highest of all values. But to Alva, in that moment, love was an impossible luxury, a luxury she couldn't afford for her daughter, who she loved more than anyone else, right? She could not let her daughter's life be squandered the way she felt her life had been squandered. So in that moment when Consuelo is pulling away in the carriage and she looks back and she sees her mother weeping, those aren't tears of joy. It's not a moment of triumph for Alva at all. It's a heartbreaking moment, right? Here's a woman who's been forced to make a series of absolutely impossible choices in her life. She's been forced to alienate her daughter in order to save her daughter. She's been forced to divorce her husband, to be shunned by all of society in order to maintain her sense of dignity and self-worth. She is a woman who in that moment is living an indescribable hell. But she doesn't turn back. And why doesn't she turn back? Because she does not accept society's judgment against her as legitimate. They have not given her standing, right? She has been required to keep silent while her husband runs around with her best friend and high-class prostitutes in Paris. And has the society of her time treated her with neutrality? No. One set of rules for men, one set of rules for women. One set of divorce rules for men, another for women. One set of rules of conduct for men, another for women. Right? She is in that moment in a position that all radicals are at the beginning of their transformation, and that is that she's angry. Now, I think it's really important just to pause for a moment and think about the consequences and the forms that this kind of anger takes in the world that we live in. You know, we're in the middle right now of this extraordinary crisis in Europe over the euro. And the country at the heart of the crisis, of course, is Greece. Right? And one of the many things that's led Greece into this crisis is the fact that Greeks don't pay their taxes. Right? 95% of Canadians pay their taxes, honestly. The same number in Greece is probably less than 40%. And it's very easy for us to take a look at the difference in those statistics and say, we are a honest and law-abiding people, and they are not. But that's not true. Right? The correct way, I think, to diagnose that difference is to say that we live in a society that has a tax system that we perceive as legitimate. Right? It grants us standing. If we think there is something very wrong with the way the tax system works, we are allowed to stand up, to voice our objections, and under most circumstances, we will be heard. We also live in a society where the tax system is conducted with neutrality. There isn't one tax code for the wealthy and one tax code for the poor. Right? We all have the same tax code. This isn't the United States. You all have the same tax code. Right? And furthermore, it's trustworthy. You know that the way that the system is today is not going to be dramatically different tomorrow. And that makes you feel safe in paying your taxes. You know you're not going to be blindsided by some dramatic, arbitrary transformation in the code in the next 6 months. Greeks have none of those reassurances. They don't believe that when they stand up and voice objections to their tax code, their voice will be heard. They don't believe their tax code is neutral. They believe, with, I think, some justification, that there is one set of rules for people of privilege and another for people without privilege. And most importantly, they don't believe their system is trustworthy. Right? They have every expectation that the system they live under today is going to look very different tomorrow. So in those circumstances, it makes total sense, in a certain kind of way, that they would not comply with authority when it came to paying their taxes. Well, let me give you another very different explanation, very different example of this very same phenomenon. Think about what it means to be the child of an abusive alcoholic, right? Someone who submits you to all kinds of physical and verbal abuse. What is it about that situation, that environment, that is so incredibly toxic and harmful? Well, in one sense, it is the nature of the violence, right? The violence acts themselves. That's harmful. But that's not the whole story. Alcoholics rarely kill their children or maim them or injure them in some permanent way. No, the real issue is actually deeper than that. The real issue is that the kind of violence enacted by alcoholic parents is illegitimate, right? The child is not given any kind of standing when it comes to the administration of discipline. They can't stand up and make an argument about defending themselves or explaining their position. No, there's none of that. Nor is the administration of authority neutral. But one of the things we know about alcoholic parents is that they routinely single out one child for a special kind of abuse and leave the others alone. And thirdly, and most importantly, it is not trustworthy, right? There is absolutely no way to know from one moment to the next whether your parent, how your parent is going to behave. The very hallmark of the kind of discipline and violence enacted by the alcoholic parent is its unpredictability. And you add those three things together, and you have the kind of violence that leaves scars that last a lifetime. Right? I think about this all the time when I read accounts of the war in Afghanistan. The United States goes to great lengths to justify its presence there. And whenever they do, they make an argument about how extraordinarily efficient the use of drones has become in recent years, right? That they've gotten so good in the use of drones now that they basically rarely kill someone who's innocent and almost always kill someone who they were intending to target. And they use that argument as a justification for their presence there. And here's the problem with that argument. It's completely and utterly irrelevant, right? From the standpoint of people living in Afghanistan, the issue is not the efficiency with which America is fighting the war. The issue is the legitimacy of the war. And from their standpoint, the war is completely illegitimate. And to me, the most telling statistic is that as you look at the number of people who have been killed by drones, and it's risen dramatically over the last 3 years, the number of drone attacks has increased. We've killed more and more and more and more insurgents. You will see the number of insurgent attacks on American forces has risen at exactly the same rate. The more we kill them, the more they hit back, right? It has nothing to do with deterrence. Deterrence isn't working. Why? Because deterrence has nothing to do with it. Right? The more we hit them, the angrier they get. The more we hit them, the more they become convinced that American presence there is fundamentally illegitimate. We're using exactly the wrong frame of reference to understand and justify and make sense of that particular conflict. So back to Alva. Here we have this rich and powerful and profoundly unhappy woman. She's angry. She's been denied legitimacy by the society of which she's a part. She's a kind of ticking time bomb. And in the greatest of ironies, the charge that sets her off turns out to come from her daughter, Consuelo. In her years of marriage to Sonny, Consuelo bears him two sons, as she likes to say, an heir and a spare. I love that. And then after she's done that, she leaves him. And she does that so gracefully that all of London society rallies around her and not around her titled husband. At the same time, in her years as his wife, she has developed a powerful social conscience. And she's become one of the most important reformers and philanthropists of her day. And she's turned into this tall, beautiful, charismatic woman. And in the spring of 1908, she returns to New York, and she gives a famous speech before all of the society women of New York City at the Waldorf Astoria. And what she's discovered in her years in England is that England in the 1890s and the early part of the 20th century was far more advanced than the United States. Women were allowed to play a real and important role in the life of English society. They were allowed to do meaningful work. They were allowed to participate politically. They were allowed to push for social reform. And Consuelo basically stands up and tells all of these women in front of her, the cream of American society, she basically tells them that they're wasting their time, that they are prisoners of a system that is squandering their abilities. And she says at one point, the necessity to adjust herself to man, to be judged by his individual standard, and to conform her whole personality to his ways of thinking has robbed women of the power, strength, and influence she would have exerted as a united and independent majority. She basically says to all of these women, you've been slaves, wake up. And in the audience is Alva. She's listening to her daughter say this. And you can only imagine how she feels. 15 years ago, she sent her daughter off in tears because she felt that was the only way she could save her daughter. And now her daughter has come back to America, and lo and behold, she's been saved, right? And after the talk, Consuela and Alva get together, and Consuela says to Alva, she says, in spite of all that happened, I'm glad I married an Englishman. And you can imagine what that does for Alva in that moment. It's like she's been granted absolution by her daughter. An incredible burden of guilt is lifted off her, and suddenly she feels free to do the kinds of things that she would never have imagined possible. And not long after that, Alva accepts an invitation to go to a meeting of the suffragette movement in New York City. And of course, women in that era, in the early part of the 20th century, throughout the world and the United States, had almost no voting rights whatsoever. In the United States, in 1900, only 4 American states granted women the right to vote: Idaho, Colorado, Utah, and Wyoming. 4 states with very small populations. And that granting of women's voting rights had happened 30 years before. Basically, the suffragette movement had ground to a halt. And Alva listens to this presentation on women's rights, and she realizes that this cause has no visibility, no energy, no money, and no strategic direction. And those are all 4 things that she realizes she can provide, that she has in spades. And she also realizes that the way out of this legitimacy problem, the only way to solve the crisis of legitimacy that has left us so angry, is to win the vote for women, to give women an equal chance to voice and to be treated neutrally and to be treated fairly and to be treated with respect. That the key to everything that has made her life so miserable is to win the same voting rights for women that men have enjoyed since the beginning of the American public. So she throws herself into the suffragette cause. She becomes one of the most important reformers in that movement. And she moves the headquarters of the suffragette movement from some little house in the middle of Ohio to a grand building on Fifth Avenue in New York City. And she turns her cottage out in Rhode Island into a conference center and has one meeting of suffragettes after another. And she energizes the movement, and she goes to black women, and she says, you belong in this movement as well. You shouldn't be doing something separate. Come and join our cause. And when the movement grows conservative, she pressures them to keep pushing for a more and more aggressive agenda. And she says the only thing we should be fighting for is a constitutional amendment. And when some of the women who involved in the suffragette movement start to get a little worried that they might be antagonizing men, it's Alva who stands up and says, men would never worry about antagonizing men. Why are we? And through the years of the First World War, when many women in that movement say, this is a time for us to step back and to allow the greater cause of the war to take precedence over our own struggle, it's Alva who stands up and says, no, voting rights for women is every bit as important, if not more important, than fighting some war in distant Europe. And she's the one who makes sure that every single day during the First World War, there are women picketing outside the White House calling for women's suffrage. And you all know what happens to her. She's vilified. She's ostracized. She's denounced. But what happens on May 19th, 1919? The 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution is passed, granting women full and complete suffrage. Alva wins. And the lesson of that victory is the same today as it was back then. It's the same for Arab dictators who try and hold down their populations, and it applies equally to American governments who kidnap people and take them to undisclosed locations and torture them. And the lesson is this, that the powerful are judged not just by their ends, they are judged by their means. And if you deny people legitimacy, they will one day, by one means or another, come back and defeat you. Now there's a postscript to the Alva story. She dies in January of 1933 and from a stroke. And her funeral's held in St. Thomas Cathedral on Fifth Avenue, the very same church where her daughter got married 40 years before. And every single prominent feminist from around the world attends, and the crowds once again gather along Fifth Avenue, and the limousines line up on the street, and the most prominent women's rights activists in the country carry her coffin into the church, and the congregation sings 2 hymns. The first is the battle cry of the suffragette movement, which is called the March of the Women. And the second is a hymn that was composed by Alva herself, which I think is the perfect summary of this strange and wonderful and powerful woman. And the hymn is all about Alva going to heaven and how she'd be damned if she was going to let some man named St. Peter pass judgment on her. And it begins, "No waiting at the gates of paradise, no tribunal of men to judge. The watchers of the tower proclaim, a daughter of the king."